Well, welcome everybody. I'm David Blight. I'm the director of the Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery and Abolition at Yale University. We're helping host this extraordinary event today on Black soldiers and Civil War photography. The panel, which I will introduce in a moment, is a star-studded, and I should say large panel, whom I will introduce in a moment. This is built around the work of Deborah Willis, and particularly her book, which I will show here. This book, just out last year, The Black Civil War Soldier, A Visual History of Conflict and Citizenship. This is also sponsored by the two new editors of the journal, Civil War Journal, Jim Downs and Crystal Feimster. Jim is editor, Crystal associate editor, as I understand it, having just taken over the journal a year or so ago. I must say that journal, I go back with that journal further than I'd care to even admit. When I came into this profession in graduate school, that was a very important journal in my field. Everybody wanted to get published in it, do a book review in it, and so on. It had already been around then, I think, for a decade or two. So it's a venerable old journal, and it over the years has published some extremely important articles in this field, and not all about military history, I must say. But under the new editorship, it is reaching out to an ever wider interdisciplinary kind of scholarship on the Civil War era. It is often said, virtually all of us in this field now say, that the American Civil War period is a kind of second American Revolution. It was. And arguably one of its most, if not the most, revolutionary aspects were those Black Civil War soldiers, Black men. Around 80% of them, before the war was over, who were former slaves, with blue uniforms and muskets on their shoulder and cartridge boxes on their belts, who went to war for their own freedom, the freedom of their families, their people, and for the reinvention and transformation of the United States. It's an extraordinary story, of course, and it has been documented over time by another revolution, and that's the revolution of photography. And we've got a group of scholars of photography and art history and of history gathered here to discuss Deborah Willis's book, but also this phenomenon of the Black Civil War soldier and the photographs of that era. Let me get right at it as quick as I can do these introductions. This is an extraordinary group of people. I could talk all day about them, but I won't, promise. First is Deborah Willis, around whose book we built this. She's a university professor of photography and imaging at the Tisch School of the Arts in New York, at New York University. She's been a MacArthur Fellow, received all kinds of other fellowships over time. She's the author of this book, Black Civil War Soldier, and also the book Posing Beauty, African-American Images from the 1890s to the present, and a host of other written works and exhibitions she has curated over time. Deborah, thank you for submitting your book to this collective review. And then Jim Downs, who put this panel together with his colleague, Crystal. Jim is currently a professor of history at Gettysburg College. He runs their Civil War Studies program there now. He's the author of Maladies of Empire, How Colonialism, Slavery, and War Transformed Medicine, and the earlier book, which made a very big splash, Sick from Freedom, African-American Sickness and Suffering during the Civil War and Reconstruction era. And as I said, is the new editor of Civil War History. Cheryl Finley is director of the Atlanta University Center for Art History. She teaches at both Spelman College in Atlanta and at Cornell University in Ithaca, New York. She's the author prominently of the book Committed to Memory, The Art of the Slave Ship Icon. She now studies photography as an art historian more than she used to study primarily formal artworks. And she's working now on a book project called Black Art Futures. And I must say, Cheryl did her PhD in art history and FM here at Yale. Matthew Fox-Amato is a professor of history at the University of Idaho. He's the author of Exposing Slavery, Photography, Human Bondage, and the Birth of Modern Visual Politics in America. It won book prizes of all sorts. It was a finalist for some of some other large book prizes. He's working on two projects. One is on the memory of American slavery in American photography, big subject, and a second book on a history of the White House photographer, which is itself an institution. Sarah Elizabeth Lewis is a professor of history of art and architecture and African American studies at Harvard University. She's the founder of the Vision and Justice Project. She's been a fellow here at the Gilder Lehrman Center, as has Jim Downs, by the way, and I may leave someone else out. Lots of people have been. She has written a number of books. She's edited volumes, including the book called The Rise, which has been translated into 7 languages. She's worked with Carrie Mae Weems, the photographer and scholar of photography. And she's a Andrew Carnegie Fellow, which is a big deal in this world, if you haven't heard of that. Anyway, she's also written, or is about to publish, a book called Caucasian War, How Race Changed Sight in America. I told you this was a distinguished panel on this particular subject. Nell Painter, who is hard to introduce in very short terms, she sometimes calls herself now Nell Painter, the artist formerly known as a historian. I will always know her as an historian. She wrote, among many other books, The Exodusters, the best book ever written on the Exoduster phenomenon of the late 1870s. She wrote the book White People, A History of White People. She wrote a biography of Sojourner Truth. And she wrote a memoir recently called Old in Art School, which is a must read. Anyway, she has degrees now in painting as well as history from 2 different institutions at Rutgers and at the Rhode Island School of Design. Anne Shumard is the senior curator of photographs at the Smithsonian's National Portrait Gallery. Anne has been instrumental in collecting, curating, and bringing to the world lots of these photographs, but a lot of other images about particularly the Civil War era. She contributed to all sorts of publications, Let Your Motto Be Resistance, African American Portraits, back in 2007, the Smithsonian Civil War volume, Inside the National Collection, which I have it right here, Anne, right down here in the bottom shelf, because it takes a high shelf. And many, many other collections, especially about 19th century photography and daguerreotypery and so forth. And last but not least, I think I've got everybody. Crystal Feimster, my colleague here at Yale in African American Studies, American Studies, and History. Crystal's the author of Southern Horrors, Women and the Politics of Lynching. She's at work on a book on Civil War Louisiana, or Louisiana in the Civil War era, called Truth Be Told, and also a work on the history of rape in the Civil War period. Now, I think I've got everybody, Jim, and I'm going to turn it over to you to begin this discussion with Cheryl, and we will all perhaps join in later if we can in the Q&A. So welcome to everybody, and welcome to our wonderful large audience for a late Friday afternoon. Thank you all for coming. Jim Downs.
Great. Well, thank you so much, David, for the introductions. And most of all, thank you so much for co-sponsoring this event with Civil War History. A huge shout out to everyone at GLC, Daniel, Michelle, Zacks, Melissa, everyone who helped to organize this. Before we begin, I just want to say that Crystal and I are thrilled to collaborate with GLC because as editors of the journal, we have two important missions. First, we want to center the experience of Black people during the Civil War era. And second, we really want this Civil War history to be an interdisciplinary enterprise. And to that end, our editorial board is extraordinarily interdisciplinary. Joining us today is Sarah Lewis, who is irrepressibly brilliant and a wonderful interdisciplinary scholar trained in art history. And a big shout out and thank you to our other editorial board member, Gwendolyn Du Bois Shaw at the University of Pennsylvania, who helped to organize this panel behind the scenes. Crystal was involved with our first roundtable on the brilliant work of Thavolia Glymph, and so I'm taking over as the moderator of this panel. I'm really bringing together some of the nation's leading art scholars, historians, interdisciplinary thinkers to talk about this book, to talk about Deborah Willis's magnificent achievement in combining these amazing images between two covers. So I will periodically ask questions to generate discussion, but I'm really looking to the panelists for an organic discussion. We're going to begin with just a brief 5 to 7 minute introduction to the book by Deborah Willis, and I'm so deeply honored and thrilled that she's able to participate in this panel, and I'm grateful to everyone else who's involved. So Deborah, to you.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you, David, and everyone else here. It's really great to be with colleagues and friends to share our work. And I'm going to share the screen. I am in the offices at PAFA, so I'm not in my office. So I'm hoping this will all work out together. Okay. So I'd like to start off with a thank you, but also just to share just some moments about why the book, why it was important for me to organize this book and to think about the research. One was to think that in 1861, April 12th, when the first shots were fired at Fort Sumter, Black people were already wanting to desire to fight for their freedom, and they were unable to. Black people could not fight at that time, not until a few years later. But here, this is the beginning of Civil War photography and also American photojournalism, which also has the concept of how do we think about 180,000 Black men and some women who served in the Union Army and some in the Navy. And to consider that experience, I wanted to have a book that talked about the idea of citizenship, because so many of the soldiers, Black people during that time, even though they were bonded, they saw themselves as citizens. So this book is full of images and letters and newspaper accounts. And I felt that their stories have been invisible for too long, and that it was necessary for me to go into the archives that was not hidden, but to see that to spend time in the archives, from public archives to private, but also to some of the universities. Starting off with the first image is the cover of the book, and it's Nimrod Burke. He is posed with e pluribus unum on the cover of this image, of the casing of the image. The designer of the book was also important. He thought about how to tell the story, but also the notion of citizenship in America, and also the idea of the emblematic American flag was a central way of the story. The Nimrod Burke is holding the pistol to his chest, and we see the US brass button, also enhanced by the photographer, and also the hand-tinted image. And then another image of a soldier in an encased image. What we've learned from Sarah Lewis and others who's written about the Civil War is that Civil War, the photography and the writing about photography inspired the experience of Frederick Douglass to write and think about citizenship, think about humanity, And how do we see photography through these moments? But he also was instrumental in creating banners in terms of gathering Black men and women to fight. And he created Men of Color to Arms. He was reminding people that in 3 years service, you will be able to fight for liberty for the Union. One of the things that most important aspects of this that I see here in this broadside, where it says, "Are free men less brave than slaves?" And he is challenging free men to fight alongside people who were enslaved. So we appeal to you to fight men of color and to arms. So here is an image of Frederick Douglass during the time of the war. So I'm going to share a few images that are in the book, and NYU Press published the book. We see the backdrop as a way of also enhancing the story. There's something about looking at these images that helps to shape my own research about memory and personal and public, that the backdrop of the American flag enhanced with red, white, and blue, the soldier also again with the US brass button, and also how families were central in sharing this moment where Black soldiers would take their children, wives, and family to be photographed because no one knew about the return. So when we think about looking at these histories and thinking about the images, there's so many stories, such as this, another image enhanced the photography. We see this young couple, married couple. We see also the US brass button enhanced with this gold leaf. The woman, the wife, has her earrings, but also there's a letter. This is not Martha, but I'm just using this as an illustration. She writes a letter, "My dear husband, who has joined the war, who's left the plantation," and she's left on the plantation with her children and being abused. So she has a letter sent to him about her own personal troubles and experience, and then also other people on the plantation. And then she shares other moments. Tell Isaac that his mother has the clothes that she sent. She's begging him to not forget her or the children. I felt also in Philadelphia, there was a free military school for colored troops, downtown Chestnut Street. I love this image where we see the soldiers standing outside, waiting to join, waiting to have this class, the class to teach them not only military service, but also the literature, the humanities, and science. And this was an exchange for Black people, some who were free, some recently self-emancipated. And another image that I found, another in the newspapers, I found other types of story that enhanced the photographs. This is not Garland White, but this is an image of a soldier standing in the studio. But Garland White's entered when the Union Army took over Richmond, Virginia. Black soldiers walked through the town proud and large groups. There were a number of Black people in Virginia who traveled to Richmond to see if their sons were brothers, cousins, related family members were a part of the troops. There was one woman who looked for a man by the name of Garland White. She meets him, she asks, "What is your name?" "Nancy." What is your mother's name? He says, "Nancy." "Where were you born?" And he says, "In the state." She goes through a number of questions, and then she ends up by saying, where did you live? Where do you live now? "In Ohio." And she says, "This is your mother, Garland, who are you now talking to, who has spent 20 years of grief about her son." So here we begin to see the importance of storytelling, the aspect of how enslaved people were able to follow some of their family members who were sold into slavery. And she was able to track his life for 20 years, where he lived in Georgia, he went to Canada, and he went to Washington. So we see the importance of these stories. They're soldiers and sailors, and then also people who were enslaved and in this state of freedom and in bondage. And they were called by General Butler contraband of war. And so here we see a group that are called contraband of war. There's a woman with a hat, a bonnet, takes her hat off so that she could be seen to be photographed. There's a pregnant woman, there's a nurse. So we begin to see the importance of storytelling with women and the work behind the war, such as Susie King Taylor, who also taught men, Black men, how to read and write in the Company E in South Carolina. Her story she wrote in 1902, and we begin to see the importance of women in their role as caregivers, washerwomen. Also, the idea of citizenship we see again in collaboration with a photographer, red, white, and blue painted. So we begin to see the belief that these people could see within the framing. The US breast button possibly given to her by a soldier. Love letters between Lewis Douglass and Amelia Logan. Over time, he was engaged to her. He fought in South Carolina with the 54th, and we began to understand their relationship. She lived in upstate New York, and he writes to her, "My dear girl, while I'm away, don't fret. I'm fighting this for humanity. We need to be a part of this fight because we are the most abused and despised race on the earth." And so they sent a number of letters over time and photographs they shared and the hope for the future, and they eventually married. Here's a Sgt Henry Stewart who entered at the age of 23. He died not in the war, but he died because of diseases. And so we began to see how many young men died because of disease. And this is a man who was only in for 8 months. Soldiers that I found really important to see that there were surgeons. There were 9 that I was able to identify through research. Jill Newmark had a show at an exhibition in Washington, DC. And so we began to see the story of Alexander Augusta, who writes a letter to Abraham Lincoln, asking that he become a doctor to take care of the Black troops. So here's the original letter, his photograph. And J.P. Ball was the only Black photographer that I could identify. It was part of photographing Black people during the war. He photographed many white soldiers, but here he photographs a young woman who dressed as a boy and disguised as a boy who was self-emancipated, but also guided through with these 2 sergeants on their way to Wisconsin. The National Archives pension record was a central place as well, where we see a photograph of Henry Brewster that was sent by his widow, Susan Brewster, stating, "This is my only photograph," and she requested it to be returned. She was trying to get her husband's pension. She had to prove it a number of times, and she never received his pension, and of course, never received the photograph because it was still in the archives when I visited. So that's just kind of a brief story of some of the images. There are over 100 images, and I wanted to create a way for you to see the importance of this book and this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Deborah. Also, that image, it's so haunting that it's left in the archives. It's actually how the book begins. You begin with that story. So it's a great way to sort of end this presentation. And it's fascinating and sad that it's unfortunately still left there today.
Yeah.
I guess what I want to sort of begin by asking the panelists to address the issue of invisibility that Deborah brought up in the very beginning of her presentation. And we can think as historians of the Civil War, there are tons of books, articles on the Black soldier that are growing, but ultimately within popular memory, another facet of the book and an idea that Deborah mentioned, it seems to be that the Black soldier remains invisible within that province of ideas. So I'm wondering if panelists could talk about the significance of the book in regard to invisibility. And you could
everyone turn on their cameras, right?
No, we need you to turn your cameras on. Yeah.
Yeah.
So who would like to go first?
Well, okay.
Thank you.
I'm going to speak as a historian. even though I'm also here as a visual person, I was not a specialist in this era. And in fact, my Civil War speech was not included in Gettysburg. But I was struck with this magnificent book. It's a triumph of historical research, of interdisciplinary historical research, so that we have the images and the text, and they're all together. Now, back in the 20th century, when we first started working in African American studies, some of the books that are foundational in this work came out. Like I found several dates of publication, 1991, for instance. I'm not sure Charlotte Fortin is 1991, but Thomas Morris Chester, the Civil War reporter, his book came out, but all of these were scattered around. And what Deb has done is pull these together with these riveting images. And you spoke about popular culture, which is so visual. And so her mastery, her mistresy with images pulls in people who are not attuned to text or not attuned to history, and bringing them together with these multifaceted, multi-layered. I was struck by the journal, for instance, we see a page of the journal of one of the doctors, just to see this kind of documentation. And then Deb has done us a real service as an author, because the authorial voice is very strong, but it pulls together and pulls out the way the images and the text and the documents, both visual and textual, work together. It's a magnificent book.
Thank you.
Great. Who else?
I'll just add something quickly, and thank you so much for giving us that tip of the iceberg, Deb, and Nell, for getting us started on your really good question about invisibility. And I think that to add, one of the things that I love is just the way that this book communicates. You talk about, not just the images, and you show us these varied images, but you also give the background to the images themselves through love letters, through different forms of communication that we know many of the soldiers and their families would have been involved in. And this way in which they communicate, as you shared, tells stories, but also, I think what we see as scholars, and even those of us who may not necessarily go in and out of the archive so much, is the way that you've been doing the work of uncovering and really discovering, digging in various archives. And so I would say the thing that for all of us becomes so visible is how important your scholarship is, and how important the archive remains, the archives plural. And that, even if one might be a historian or an art historian or a photo historian or a sociologist for that matter, or a curator, that going to multiple archives is something that is the work that we have to do to show that multi-layered history and story that's so incredibly nuanced by the beautiful letters. And there was one that I was looking at just before we got on page 53, and it stuck out to me. And this is, of course, something that you know, Deb, I read in earlier iterations, but a letter written by a William H. Johnson, and not the painter that we know as William H. Johnson, where he talks about from the 27th of February, 1862, a way in which they're really kind of going forward and winning a war, this enthusiasm of joy of being able to actually see the advances that are being made. And this is an account that's being given of federal troops defeated the rebel defenders on February 7th and 8th, 1862. And he goes on, hour by hour. 4 p.m., the bombardment is progressing with great fury. 5 p.m., we're gaining upon the rebels. Our troops are being landed in small boats in the face of the enemy's batteries, and so on. So just kind of the intensity and enthusiasm that you were able to share with us from their letters and from your research, I think is really, really powerful and brings so much out of the shadows that we know is there. So thank you for that.
Thank you. It was really difficult to edit William H. Johnson. He had so many wonderful accounts, difficult, but his enthusiasm and his belief in the fight for freedom, even though he tried to fight early on and could not, and decided to become a correspondent. And that was, really a central part of why his story is unknown for many of us. So that's really important. Thank you.
Thank you.
Matt?
Sorry.
Yeah,
Just on what Deb said and what Cheryl said about the importance that the people then saw in documentation. So Cheryl talked about, a reporter right at the very end of the war. Daniel A.P. Murray says, we've got to memorialize this.
Mhm.
It's one of the themes that comes through. The people at the time knew how important this was.
Mhm.
Matt, and then Sarah.
yeah, I want to first just kind of celebrate the richness of this book. I mean, just reading through, I was like, oh my gosh, it's just stunning visually, alongside the getting to read the full letters, which was such a kind of, I think, striking experience as people are commenting on. On this issue of invisibility, I was thinking as I was reading about kind of where this book fits in the broad sweep of studies of Civil War photography. And I want to kind of throw out an arc here where it kind of picks up on, which is to think about, over the past few decades, an emphasis on battles and death in Civil War photography,
Mhm.
to an emphasis on race, racism, slavery, and emancipation. And, when I was thinking about some of the earlier work, like, William Fresnito's book from the 70s on Antietam, Keith Davis's article, Alan Trachtenberg's book, which came out, has a great chapter in the 80s. There's a real focus on kind of Brady, Gardner, this visual transformation that we see, in which all of a sudden a war is photographed in mass, and sort of trying to understand what that meant, to, I think, the kind of past 2 decades, which have really broadly shifted the focus towards race, Black soldiers, and things of that nature. I'm thinking about John Stauffer's work on Frederick Douglass, Darcy Grigsby's work on Sojourner Truth. Nell Painter's earlier chapter on Sojourner Truth also I love. I think that book is from the 90s, so a kind of earlier plot point. But I see this book as kind of picking up on the kind of emergent over the past 2 decades interest in race and emancipation, and on a kind of related note, not thinking about that or those subjects through the lens of the photographer, but instead thinking about vernacular photography. So while there are, of course, images by the sort of famous artists of the day, this book for me was very much about visual self-representation.
Mhm.
And so I wonder if we might talk a little bit more about that sometime.
Okay, I think that's really an important point, because of the act of posing and the act of locating an identity outside of bondage for some of these men, and the men who were free men. Also, the whole aspect of how do we present Black masculinity in the 19th century. And dress was really important. And that's why I think the work that all the scholars on Frederick Douglass done has created, unexpected news stories to think about as we consider the idea of dress as biography and in that way. So I think that that's an important point. Sarah?
Well, it's just an honor to join in this celebration to salute Deborah Willis on the most recent publication of many. This is extraordinary. So thank you to the Gilder Lehrman Center and Civil War History Journal for this opportunity. I want to just echo everything my colleagues have said, Nell, Cheryl, and Matt, and I think adding to Matt's list of the interventions that your book makes, would just like to salute three key points relating to, Jim, your question about invisibility. One of the reasons that I think this book is a triumph is that it underscores the role of visuality in narrating and excavating and interpreting this crucible foundation in American democracy, what David Blight has called our second revolution. That is to say, it's important that this book was written by a photo historian and an art historian, right? That sets a signal for the source of and site of future scholarship about this current moment, right? Mm-hmm. Visuality is a crucial tool for understanding the Civil War. Mm-hmm. Second, accessibility. You, in a very transparent manner, show us this matrix of documentation that, because as you write in the preface, you state a large number of records are finally being digitized and becoming accessible, right? And that both in your publication and in that signal allows for new possibilities in our scholarship, right? And third, you salute both the public and private function of photographs to examine the contributions of Black Civil War soldiers whose stories have largely been overlooked. And here you show us, for example, the bonds of kinship between generations that were sustained through portraiture and photography. You mentioned one example of Sergeant Major Lewis Henry Douglass, who served in the 54th Massachusetts Infantry, which is the highest rank that an African-American man could hold, right? Exchanging letters with his then fiancée, Helen Amelia. And through that, we have a portrait of love, right? One of the many examples of these kind of moments of familial intimacy that, ironically enough, a war documentation allows us to see. So thank you for this extraordinary contribution.
I'm glad you brought that, Amelia, and that relationship up here, because we rarely talk about Black love in the 19th century. Yeah. We having a romantic relationship shared through that experience, it's really wonderful to identify. And there was one letter that I found where a woman said, I'm sending you, her husband, buttons. There were buttons. And when you slip them on, remember me, as, just the idea of that tender moment. And so we know the strife and the struggle and the brutality of that experience, but to hold on to what Black love could look like, which was hope that there was a future, there could be a possibility of a future in the 19th century, it's really central. And I'm glad you pointed that out. David?
Yeah.
Oh, Jim, I just
sorry, Jim, I'm just.
No, go ahead. Go.
I know, I just happened to see the hand.
No, go. Everyone go, yes.
I'm just so glad the Lewis and Amelia letters came up, because as you know, Deborah, from reading them, Lewis had to court her for a long time. He was crazy in love with her. And she just kept, a long time he courted her. But there's a tragic side to that too, which is what war does. His wounds were so bad that he got at Fort Wagner, terrible wounds, that he could never have children. They never had children. I was also going to say real quick on the visibility thing. Black soldiers are not invisible in textbooks. However, what your book does, Deborah, to me, I mean, there's been the obligatory Black soldier in textbooks now for, 30 years or more. But what your book does is gives them names. They're individuals, they're people, they have stories. They're not just the obligatory Black soldier face. You tell us who these people are, or you did your damnedest to find out who they are. It's not just an obligatory face, and that is a turn. There are many dimensions to visibility, I guess.
Mhm.
Anyway.
Sarah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Sarah.
Just to build on this, it's a fantastic point. You wrest authorship also from, and I think Cheryl mentioned this as well, that not just of the photographer, but of one of the landmark American artists who's been so associated with the Black Civil War soldier, and that is Winslow Homer, and put that agency back into the voices of Black Civil War soldiers themselves. So that's another way in which I think you complicate and expand beautifully this history.
Okay, so Matthew, did you have a comment? Oh, Anne, go
Anne's
ahead.
had her hand up.
Go ahead, Anne.
God, I've just lost the video. Hold on here. Well, what I was going to say is that what I really valued was the full texts that Deb's book provides, because we're used to getting these little sort of pulled out quotes that may be illuminating, but to have the privilege of reading, entire letters and, multiple pages of a diary just gives so much more context and texture to the story. And I was really appreciative of that. And I think it will be so useful for readers in the future to have those full sort of unmitigated texts where we're not just dealing with, as I say, an isolated quote here or there to make a point. You've actually got the subjects giving their own voices. And I think it's so valuable to hear that and not just, a latter day interpretation of what they were thinking or feeling, but to have that just so viscerally expressed is just a wonderful contribution.
I'm glad you brought it up, Anne, because, editors like to cut, but the editors, Eric and the editors in NYU did not want to cut these stories and these long letters, and they were long, and I had to make a decision of which letters to keep in, but it was really important for me to keep that story, that long story, even as long as the story, longer the story was, it was important to have the breadth of the experience. And that's something that I was trying to hold on to.
I thought, for example, when you had both, Robert Gould Shaw's descriptions, and then to have Charlotte Fortin, and to have them talking about the same moment in their respective, diaries and letters was just wonderful.
Yes.
I don't even know where that comes up. I've never seen that before until in your book, the way that you put those in dialogue. So I guess my question for you is, when in the research process, Deb, did you realize that you wanted this to not just be a visual project, but also to include the narratives alongside of it, as everyone has said? And then to the panelists, I'm wondering if you could sort of talk about the representation of the actual images from the archives. And Nell has talked about this a little bit in terms of the diary, in terms of Alexander Augustus's letter or Grimke's diary, that throughout the book, it's not just the images of the people, but it's also the image from the archive and what that means.
No, I think it started, I was teaching a class on Gone with the Wind, maybe about 8 years ago. And I read Hattie McDaniel's biography by I think Joe Watts. It was a fascinating story. It really engaged me on different levels. Mainly the point that was really important for me was also her father was a Civil War soldier who was injured in the war, and they fought for 17 years to try to receive his pension and never received it. And how important it was for her to tell that story, but also to expand why she needed to, she wanted that role as Mammy in the film, because she felt that her father's life needed to be known and retold, and she wanted to reimagine that based on this wonderful book. So I wanted to know more about the pension records and the pension archive, but then also I just thought it was really significant to, and I read Charlotte Fortin's diary years ago when I researched J.P. Ball, and she actually attended the Panorama in Boston when it was in Panorama. And I loved the way that she described it. And then I just continued to read her diaries. And then there she is talking about, Shaw. And then I said, wow. And the way that she described him as, like there's something girlish about him, but he's the most manly man I've seen, and I love that. But the fact that she took him to a shout meeting, to take him to hear the music of Black people, the vocals of Black people, and then he wanted her to write down the experience. That exchange to me just said, oh, I have to have this here. And then when she really liked him, and the fact that she lost him before they could actually have a good, relationship in terms of as friendships in South Carolina. Here's a woman leaving Philadelphia, dressed in pants and going to, she had a rough time when she got off the boat, but then she was rough in terms of describing the people that she met. She was hilarious. I was like, oh my God, you're saying this about, but then she really respected the experience. Why she was there to teach these children and offer and create, a way to tell a story. And also with the soldiers' diaries, we were told that Black people couldn't read or write, and then it was illegal, which was true, that people were killed if they were taught to read or write. But there are opportunities where women who were the white wives of the lieutenants, and they were there, who were sensitive to the fact that men were signing their names with X, and that they needed to sign their names, and they needed to learn how to have a full human experience. And I think that that's why I wanted to have the multiple ways of reading the newspapers. Just having the opportunity to have to read newspapers and the firsthand accounts was important for me.
Panelist, on the point of the representation of the actual text, not just the written transcriptions, but also the images from the archives of the diaries and the other textual evidence. Anything?
Yeah, there are many things to say here. One of the most, I think, important ways that Deborah Willis's book adds to what Matt Fox-Amato has called modern visual politics is that she gives us a sense of the modern visual politics of our research through how she focuses on the archive. One example is the photograph of Henry Brewster. It's on page 9 or in the fore preface. That photograph is not an image that we would have if not for the work of a researcher. Why? Because it was a photograph that was not returned to the wife of Henry Brewster, despite her request. She applied in 1905 for her husband's pension, for Henry Brewster's pension, and stated, as Deborah Willis mentioned, that this is the only photograph she has. And there it sat in the archives, right? So it animates our thinking about what research entails and means today in thinking through that withholding act, right? It politicizes the site of the archive, and it adds, I think, a heightened sense of stakes to the work that we're doing. I think it's quite poignant too, and powerful. So thank you for including those stories, the documentation, and the history that gives us a sense of how we on this panel and those who we work alongside are really continuing a work of justice, I would say, in our research.
So I was going to add, Sarah, I'm sorry, Nell. Do you mind if I just quickly add on? Thank you so much for bringing up that, that really important image and the exchange that has to do with one that talks about futurity, right? Getting one's pension means so much. It means so much in terms of, continuing legacies. And it makes me think about the power of your work, Deb, in terms of how contemporary artists and activists actually have really found this work central. If we look at the work of someone like Kathy Opie and others who've been activating since 2020 spring, many of these monuments that have been since taken down of, Civil War generals, from the South, of course. That very beautiful cover image of Nimrod Burke is one that was projected in Richmond on that monument of Lee. And, the power of that image, I think, is something that we've seen resonate through many spheres, especially in the work, again, of contemporary artists. And another artist that I would mention is someone like Whitfield Lovell, who's been, very much enamored with historical photographs, especially from this era, from the 19th century. And I just thought I would ask you, Deb and Sarah, and the other esteemed panelists as well, if you might want to say something about public memory and memory work that this book also engages. Thank you very much.
I'll let Nell.
No,
No, go ahead, Nell.
No.
I really want Sarah and Deb to talk back to what Cheryl said, and then I'll come back after that.
Yeah, I think it's when we think about public memory, Willie Williams he worked on the project for over 15 years, photographing Civil War sites as well as monuments. And I had no idea that one of the first Black monuments that created was William Carney in Norfolk, Virginia. Funds were raised by the Black people in the community to create that monument. That was totally new information. But then going back to Edmonia Lewis, where she created a bust of Colonel Shaw, and it was one of the first busts that was made during that short period after his death. So when we think about the importance of artists and arts community, celebrating the voices of people who fought for freedom, it was early on, and it's really important that these records were saved someplace, that someone, family members, people who had the organizations, Masons were really central in terms of having wherewithal to hold on to some of these documents. I think it's really essential, other than the public, the archives, that aspect of it. Sarah?
I think what I would add is, well, first, Cheryl, I think you're absolutely right. There's a critical role that artists are playing today in giving us a way to look not just back at a past, but inserting it into our contemporary conversations in a way that creates for layered compositions and layered research strategies, all of which makes the archive more public increasingly, right, over time. That is a central move that we see Hank Wells Thomas making. We see many of the artists that you mentioned making. But this is, I guess, the second thing I'd say, I think as a curator and as a researcher, this foundational site of the Civil War has become a touchstone and a way for me to think about representational justice. Mm-hmm. When I put Vision and Justice together for Aperture in 2016 and went to Michael Famighetti as the editor, I said as my first question, I'd be happy to guest edit this issue, but can I have Frederick Douglass be the touchstone for a contemporary issue, right? Is that all right? And what he didn't know was I was about to say, if not, then I'm walking. But it was in order to make memory public through the speech that Frederick Douglass authored about the power of pictures, to usher into public discourse our understanding of what was for him it seemed to be solitary, kind of private, lonely endeavor at the time. His audience was confused about the assertion he made, right, about the power of pictures to inaugurate possibilities and progress. And so 150 years later, here we have, I think, the very scholar like Deborah Willis and others who he had in mind and who he hoped would come. So So both artists are making this memory public, and I think as researchers we are as well. Yeah. Now we all want to hear from Nell.
Yeah, I want to go back to the facsimiles of the documents, particularly the handwritten ones. And I think what they do is something that jumps out to me as one of the many strengths of this book. And that is that it's working on multiple registers. One of the big ones, of course, is the community, the Black Civil War soldier as a phenomenon. But then we have these documents, and particularly the handwritten documents in which each writer has his or her own personality. And so we get the level of the individual and the particularity, which I think is the next step in African American studies, to hold both of these registers together at the same time, in which we are dealing with community and we are dealing with individual subjectivity.
Yeah.
You know, it's also the, I go on page 177, where at Yale, at the collection at Beinecke, where the soldiers are identified by the lieutenants in this album, that here are two lieutenants, one Lieutenant T. Wright, who sends an album to his mother, Sarah Wright, of all of the Black soldiers from his troop, from their troop. But he writes on the back, describing Renwick Allen as excellent, commands obedience. He describes a light-skinned one who's appreciated by his officer. But one of my favorites is the one, James Roberts, where he says, he was a drummer. He's now, he was a free man. Now he's hard to manage. He's now the bass drummer. He's stubborn and reckless. I love the way that, not only how the handwritten text also guides us to the time of how Black men are being viewed. If they're obedient, he's, buttoned up shirt. I mean, he is posing in the idea of what it means to be obedient, to be a soldier. You have to sit upright, dress, legs closed. And here is James Roberts with his legs open, unbuttoned coat on page 178, and his hat tilted to the side. It's like, I know he was fighting for his freedom. Like, wait a minute, what's happening? I'm going to just be a drummer. So I can just imagine how that aspect of it, and then also the little handwritten diaries where it says, up at dawn, just talking about the food that they ate, meeting what it meant to meet President Lincoln. And so anyway, those handwritten notes were really essential. Try to copy as many as possible.
Deborah, I want to say I was so thrilled that you reproduced the backs of those cartes de visite rather than just the transcription of the comments, because how many people don't ever see the back of something, and there can be so much information there. So, my heart leapt when I got to that page and could see that, because I think that, it's wonderful to have that context. So thanks for that.
I wonder if we might keep going on this theme of the kind of personality, the kind of individual sort of theme of individuality that sort of runs through these sources. I'm thinking of Nell's comment here and David's earlier comment about these aren't just anonymous Black soldiers, they have names. And I was really struck by that too, the feeling of biography and personality that comes from these sources. And I think for me, it gets to this question of, what do these photos reveal as evidence of the Civil War era? What can we learn about these photos? And I think at the start, at some basic level, these photos are evidence of the fact that these Black soldiers wanted the photos made. And I think that's really interesting to think about a little bit, because I think it gets us at this kind of bigger question about the Black experiences during the Civil War. So we know on some basic level that despite the fact that these images cost money, and for some they're even paying extra to get them colored different colors, and despite the ongoing conversation, the letters about unequal pay, we still see them getting their photographs made. And to me, this gets at something that now I think you were kind of talking about, which is it's both about the specific person and the broader conditions, which is to say, you know, how do we think about these images as both about the self, about self-representation, and then kind of bigger issues like community or nation. I mean, I think of all the American flags in these images. So anyway, I was really kind of struck by this issue of the kind of personality or sort of individuality that we can see in your book, Deb.
Mm-hmm. I really think that's really central, how the notion of what personality means to at that time, when we think about they visited the photographic studio and what it meant to have objects, you know, like if there's a book, holding a book up or leaning on a backdrop, what messages were being sent, not just for that moment, but for the viewer of the future, that these soldiers knew that there is a future and that there's someone, these photographs were going to be not only in the hands of possibly when so many soldiers died, so we all know, that had photographs in their hands or some in their pockets, but they also knew when they posed and went into the studio, they knew that there was an opportunity for their stories to be told. And the only way to tell that story is through posing.
Yeah. I think what I would add is it gives us a very specific way to understand the urgency behind Frederick Douglass's landmark speech, which he redrafted 3 times over the course of his life, but largely is known as Pictures in Progress. You know, why is he thinking about the function of photographs? Why did he become the most photographed American man, not African-American man in the 19th century? Well, we have one argument one could make, but beyond you know, the invention of the daguerreotype, the beginning of the photographic age, is that he understood the way in which photographs democratized representation, you know, gave everyone a means through which to present themselves as they would like to be seen, you know. Mm-hmm. And so in your book, Deb, you're really offering us the evidence of why he would spend time redrafting this speech, despite the confusion of the audience, you know, many, many times. And I think one of the, just to go back to the importance of the handwritten text to do with individuality, is that this project is both about accessibility, as I mentioned, but about also discoverability, you know, the way in which the archive is increasingly becoming porous to researchers by just including important key terms, not just broad categories, right, that give us a sense of individual subjecthood. So thank you for that. It's powerful.
You know, when we think about subjecthood, and as I mentioned about the diaries, that actually research where the size of the leather-bound diaries, they were small and they could slip in a pocket. But Christian Fleetwood was the one that I was trying to mention before in June 15th, 1864. He says up at dawn, and he talks about the weather is fine and warm, up to the front on the Saturday, the 16th, under heavy artillery, you know, under heavy fire. So we think about what it meant for them to write these stories. But I remember 30 years ago when I heard that Frederick Douglass had written about photography, but never could find any of the information. But you know, just one one instance, but to find the one that you opened up in your book, in Vision and Justice, in that wonderful volume, it really set us on a different course. I think this 21st century now, because of the 19th century vision of Frederick Douglass, we are transformed into seeing another view of the experience of Black people. And then, David, with your book, you've gone into some amazing archives that we didn't know about, but now, at the same time, I was in Martha's Vineyard and your book had just arrived in the bookstore and people were like clamoring for it. And I'm like, I need this book because I'm in the middle of my research. And it just set a tone for people who wanted to know more. It was 4 years, that Civil War, and we're still experiencing the aftermath, the after effect, the effect. It's not even after, but it's 4 years, that effect that it had. And your story on Frederick Douglass really helped shape this time.
I just wanted to say, I wasn't going to comment about the book at all, but to both of you and Sarah. Sarah, I can still remember when I was in grad school doing my first research on Douglass, and I came across in his manuscripts this speech called Pictures in Progress. And I thought, what is he doing with this? I was confused. Maybe his audiences were. What is he? And then I figured out he writes this during the Civil War. I mean, and I just copied it out on note. Those were the days of note cards, my friends. Nell remembers that. But I couldn't make sense. What is he doing with this speech? I didn't know quite what to do with it, but I didn't know about. We didn't know about all the photographs then. I mean, I didn't. I don't think anybody did until a long time later.
And I think Douglass's Pictures in Progress connects not only in the issue of democratization that Sarah was so nicely talking about earlier, but also, I'm thinking of the line where he says, people are the only picture-making animals.
Right.
And he's trying to define what it means to be human there.
Yeah.
That humans are picture makers. Right. And I think that, is also an important context for these Black soldier photographs, because, one of the contexts in which they're making these are the constraints on self-making that they experienced during slavery. Mm-hmm. This is something that, Saidiya Hartman, I think, has thought so well about, and Walter Johnson and Tavolia Glimpf, I think of her concept of small rights. I think that's not the only thing. It certainly does not define these photographs as just assertions of humanity in response to their condition under slavery. But it's certainly, I think that's something that's going on here, and something that, as you all are pointing out, Douglass was really onto.
Well, and these soldiers too, Deborah, I wonder, you must have thought this 1,000 times. They'd never been asked to present themselves.
Right, exactly.
They've been asked to say who you are.
Right.
Now they're doing it in a photo studio.
Right.
In a uniform. No wonder they, all soldiers do that. They put guns on themselves and all that stuff. But
they knew all the gestures,
Oh yeah, but they had never been asked.
Mm-hmm.
Present yourself. So anyway.
Mm-hmm.
I think it also speaks to the urgency of the moment, the urgency of their self-making, but the urgency of war, the urgency of becoming free, in the way that they posed and assumed the poses, as you said, Deb, that were poses that they might know. But it also makes me think about the apparatus and the practice of photography at that time. They had to stand very still. They had to sit very still for seconds upon seconds to be able to be legible. And I think that's another consideration of, why they did what they did and why it was so important to have their images made, especially as portraits.
Exactly.
So on that note of the act of posing and self-representation, can we also talk about the many images in the book of Civil War era Black women, which many of them are familiar and they appear in different places, but within this book, within this volume, they have a different resonance. And I'm wondering if we could sort of talk about the images, everything from the image of Sojourner Truth, most importantly of Susie King Taylor, and then even in the one that I think is so important because I was a research assistant on Harriet Jacobs' biography with Jean Yellen, and she kept on saying to me, I know there's an image of the Jacobs School, and I kept on saying, like, lady, this doesn't exist. We are not going to find this. And eventually she found it. And so the preservation of even the Jacobs School image and why and how Harriet Jacobs had her school photographed, I think is important. So I want us to sort of also maybe address the issue of gender in this.
It was really central for me. Jean is one. I was at Shumard when she was looking for images. And when I visited the Rose Library down at Emerita, I found that image and I was like, I have to, it wasn't processed yet. And I'm like, I need to have that. And I said to Randall Burkett, I said, I have to have this image. When is it going to be processed? And I bug. That was a central one for me to see. It was really, really good. But, you know, Tabolia and the work that Nell has done over the years and others who are looking at women, I felt it was like my duty to make sure that women were there and their stories were told, that dress was really important. You know, these women that picked the cotton knew the texture of what it meant to work with fabric, but to see them dressed, the clothing that they chose to pose in, the fact that the school in Alexandria, you know, the photographer wanted to show the number of kids, the children that were taught. You know, it was not just the building, but it was the children that were also part of that group portrait. So that collective portrait of that experience of the school, but also whoever wrote the X of the daughter that's in the photograph, there's like identifying both the daughter of the two in that image was important. Mm-hmm. But I see we're like up to 5:16. Do we have any public questions?
For the audience, yeah, sure.
Uh-huh.
All right, so this is a question for the audience from Adrian Van Dyke. I've grieved over Harriet Tubman being denied a pension from the U.S. Army for her services. Were obstacles frequently put in the way of Black soldiers or their widows collecting pensions that they were rightly entitled to? I'll just say Brandy Brimmer wrote a really great book on that. I want to get more to the art on widowhood, and it just came out with Duke. So that's a good one. Now,
yeah, I can tell you when I was working on Exodusters, I came across material that I didn't use for that book, but sort of in an anecdotal way, I can say, and maybe Deb is, you've been in those archives more recently than me, but my sense was that there was a lot of denying of Black widows,
yes,
and of Black survivors,
yes,
of their pensions. They had to jump through many hoops, and then I wouldn't be surprised if it was more usual not to get a pension than to get a pension.
Hands down. I mean, the control that men had over women's bodies, their income, it's still today. So we think about these Black women who cared for their husbands who were injured, who were maimed, who had difficulties seeing. The fact that Brewster's wife sent this photograph showing that he was a blacksmith and a tailor with tools. So he also photographed himself with this prior to thinking how it would be used in the future. But just the idea that he had all of this, he was actually selling himself as well during that time, as probably as a blacksmith, as you know, as a tradesman. And so that's another way of reading the actual time frame when the photographs were made, not for public, but for personal use.
And Deb, the Pension Bureau demanded reference letters, which weren't always
Reference
easy for
letters.
Black women to get.
Yes, and to prove,
Prove lawyers writing for people.
God forbid if you had another relationship, and she did, and they wanted to prove, well, what happened to the husband before that husband, and blah, blah, blah. So, but the control that they had over these Black women is just, you know, it's unbelievable.
So I just have to make another plug for Brandy Brimmer's book on that because it relates to our earlier discussion.
I know, I'm so glad you told that.
Yeah, so the person who handles the pension records in North Carolina for a lot of the Black widows, his name was Frederick Douglass. So all of these women go to a man by the name of Frederick Douglass who helps them prepare the pension applications. And so at the height of Jim Crow, you have, as Brimmer explains, all of these Black women petitioning the government for aid. It is an absolutely brilliant, wonderful book. And she does an excellent job of just walking us through the pension records and walking many of us historians through it. She remembers me calling her once from the archive saying, like, how do you find this? Because it's so.
What's the title?
I'm going to remember in a second because I never can remember on the spot like this. I'm going to get it to you and I'll put it in the chat. But her last name is Brimmer, Brimmer,
Okay.
and it's.
I just put it in the chat.
Oh, thank you. Thank
Okay,
you.
thanks.
And she was a colleague of mine here at Spelman when I first arrived. It's called claiming, Union widowhood, race, respectability, and poverty in the post-emancipation South.
Oh, thank you.
Right. So I'm going through some of the questions and I'm happy to address them. A lot of them are more general questions just about the period, about literacy and so forth. I'm hoping that we have such limited time if we could just focus more on questions about imagery and art and the photographs in the book. And I'm happy to answer Q&A about the period another place. Deb and the panel, I'm wondering if you could address this one image that you mentioned in the beginning of the Black soldier and how he asks for his family to be brought into the photograph. And was that common? And what was the purpose for that, and politically and historiographically, and why is that so significant for us today?
Well, in reading that image, I see it as an opportunity for this 21st century viewer to see how important family was to this man. That photograph was just recently, my minds are going to 19th and 20th century writers, but Hunter wrote about that photograph in Marriage,
right.
the experience of marriage, Sarah Hunter. But and he was recently identified that it was he was in Cecil County, Maryland. That photograph was just recently identified. But the fact is that we see young girls in their bonnets, a wife who looks very nervous and concerned. And if you look closely at her and their pose, but the fact that he is taking them, and I see this as a reminder of family. If he dies, you know, there's no evidence of his presence. We know that mortuary portraits were made during the 19th century with daguerreotypes and all of those experiences of the dead children. But the opportunity to have these images, I believe, gave him hope, and they embraced the family as well on both sides. And because there are more than one, the photographs circulated and reproduced in other places. So I think that's another telling point of the life of that photograph.
Right. I'm also wondering if we could talk a little bit more about the politics of collecting and the preservation of these images. So you mentioned in the book that the Black press is instrumental in preserving these images. There's the wonderful letter that you excerpt of the one soldier writing to the Black newspaper, the Anglo-African, and you describe that he's writing to the newspaper as if he's almost writing to a friend. And so that the Black press becomes really instrumental in preserving these images. But as I was going through the citation, some of them are kept by Howard, some of these images, but some of them are also in private hands. And so I'm wondering if Anne and anyone else could talk about the place of these images today. Where are they? Who has them? How can we gain access to them? How are people like scholars able to draw on them?
I think Anne and Cheryl should take that because Cheryl also has a wonderful album. But Anne?
Sure, I can just dive in. Of course, I'm at the National Portrait Gallery. We have worked very hard to try to expand our representation of African-American subjects across the centuries, but there's been a real push to cover more adequately the period of the Civil War and Reconstruction. It does involve, making connections with collectors. Obviously, there are sales, there are auctions, there are opportunities, to bid in the sort of public marketplace, but that's getting harder and harder for institutions such as the Portrait Gallery, because there are enough deep-pocketed private collectors that can very quickly bid up the price of something that would be of interest, to the national collection. A good example would be the carte de visite of Martin Delany that sold for nearly $60,000 in 2021. The Portrait Gallery bid, but we were blown out of the water. I mean, it went way past us. But fortunately, I was able to, through my networks, I connected with the individual who now owns it, and he's lending it to the Portrait Gallery, and it will actually be on view, paired with the beautiful hand-colored lithograph that we have of Delany that has long resided in the Portrait Gallery's collection. So there's an opportunity where we couldn't acquire the piece because we simply didn't have the resources, but we've been able to connect with the current owner, who's been very generous in lending it. And I think that is, that's important to have, to work on those relationships. Clearly, we borrow and exchange with other institutions, but increasingly, some of the richest collections are privately held. So.
Thanks, Anne. And I would agree that those public-private partnerships are so important. And just to maybe mention a couple of places to look, Cornell has an amazing collection of photography, especially dating from the period of the Civil War, because it's also around the time that the university was founded. And there were, many people who were interested in ending the Civil War and in abolitionism. So there's a great collection there that's in the Rare Book and Manuscript Library, the Croak Rare Book and Manuscript Library. You mentioned the Rose Library at Emory, and of course Randall Burkett was, just amazing in terms of the way that he built that collection. And I think many of us here know the Beinecke very well. And just in thinking about, as you started talking, Anne, about those private collections, I remember placing a private collection or helping to place a private collection at the Beinecke just before I started, coincidentally, a graduate school. It was collected by a man named Randolph Lindsley Simpson, who had collected another series of images and also works of art, not just photography, that's at the Amistad collection at the Wadsworth Athenaeum in Connecticut. But this collection that ultimately went to the Beinecke was of primarily 19th century photographs of African Americans, and many dating from the period of the Civil War. So those are just some ideas that I would share. But yeah, it's really important to kind of have those connections and relationships to be able to make the work available and hopefully promised gifts down the line to your institution.
I wonder too. Oh, go ahead, Matt.
Sure. On this theme of preservation, Deb, I was curious. I was thinking about the sort of social lives of these images after 1865, and the Susan Brewster example is just, it's so interesting. Not only because she has the photograph of him after the war, but also the sort of creative ways in which she uses the photograph as evidence. And I was just curious if you saw doing your research, is there a kind of a broader history of familial preservation of these images in the late 19th century onwards? Like, I'm just sort of curious what that looks like.
Yeah, families have, when I worked at the Shumard, at the Shumard, as well as the African American Museum project, before it became the museum, there were a number of families who shared their photographs. They had daguerreotypes, carts, storytelling aspects to all of the collections that they had, and they organized, and they wanted to, this was evidence, as again, that Black people had a history, they preserved their history, and they wanted it to be presented within the National African American Museum of History and Culture. They had a strong desire. We can go back to the Schomburg Center when I was there in the 80s, the same experience. Families would come in in bags, and giving us their photographs to preserve. And the New York Public Library had great conservators who were concerned about these images, and it was great to be a part of that early. It was just out of graduate school, and to be a part of that was really central.
Deborah, I wondered too, has anyone ever, maybe you have, but has anyone ever really dug deep into those Midwestern state historical societies? And by that, Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Illinois, because they have masses of
Oh my God.
diaries.
I've been there. I've been there.
Okay.
They are fantastic. And I'm like,
they have masses of diaries and letters.
diaries and letters. And, when we think about Nell and the Exodusters, I was in Nebraska, I was in Montana. I mean, the presence of Black people there lost, but it's in the archives.
Yeah.
And I think that's really, it's beautiful to research out there.
Somebody
I was in Colorado as well.
Somebody needs to get a little melon grant and kind of do a total 2-year survey of all those Midwestern historical societies.
Yeah. Okay.
By the way, one of my favorite photographs in this book is in the last section, that reunion photo from 1912.
Isn't that's in the Charles Blockson collection here at Temple University? I love that photograph.
There were lots of Black reunions, but you don't see many photographs.
You don't see the GAR. You only
GAR. This is a Black GAR gathering. And
didn't know it, but to see these granddaughters walking with their grandfathers. Oh,
yeah.
Oh, I love that you just. I love the fact that you love that too. Yeah.
Oh God, yeah. No, that's a stunner.
Now, when you're talking about conservation, I knew Charles Blockson when I taught at Penn, and he had a lot of trouble placing his collection. The institutions did not see the value. Luckily, it was Temple, wasn't it, that finally took the
Yes.
Yeah.
But it was a job to find a home.
Yeah, I think his hook became the Underground Railroad because everybody got interested in the Underground Railroad.
But he also, I know we're at time, I just wanted to add about Blockson and his legacy. He also wrote about, not only did he amass the collection that he had, but he also wrote about, a guide to collect, how to collect for Black people, and how important it was to know about collecting and to preserve our own culture.
Yeah. Yeah, there's, we are at time. I just wanted to salute the work of, as you do, as you embody, Deb, the work of the archivist, the work of these librarians we all rely upon. One of whom in my life at Harvard is Dorothy Berry, who's really made at Houghton Library works much more accessible. And just want to salute, for example, as one of the, just as an example, the many examples that are happening around the country, what she did. At Houghton and Harvard's archives more broadly, they paused collecting on and focused as a prioritization on African-American ephemera for 1 year in order to really shore up this vital aspect of American history and life. That kind of leadership is often coming from archivists, coming from librarians, it is coming from the exchange they have with us and with researchers. oftentimes the emails I receive are, can you teach from this material that I might buy of African Americans, tintypes from the 1860s? Of course I can teach with them. Yes, please acquire them. And that gives me the motivation, ammunition, and demand to create an agenda like that. So Dorothy Berry's one of many that allows for the work that we're celebrating today.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. Thank you all. Jim, for organizing this, and Crystal, David, it's really to have my friends together here. It's like fantastic.
Great. So thank you to everyone. I really appreciate it. I'm really grateful to GLC for helping to co-sponsor this and to host it. And to everyone who participated, you will be hearing from me soon with a transcript of this conversation, which will then be edited and for just proofreading's sake, and then published in our December 2022 issue. So we're really excited that we will have this transcript available for.
What about the questions? Will they also be a part of it as well?
Some of them will be, if there are, yeah, if you want, we haven't.
No, I hadn't had a chance to see them. I was just curious.
I'll look
Just in case there's some that we may be helpful with further research. When David says that we'll get a grant, maybe there's someone from Mellon on the.
All of that, everything that was said will be in the journal. It's just that, yeah, all of that will be in.
No, I mean the posted.
No, I know the poster. That's what I thought you meant initially. Yeah, I'll have to look through. We'll see. Yeah, I'm happy to do it. Yeah, we're happy to be as authentic as possible. So thank you to everyone.
Thank
I
you.
really appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right.